Welcome to the Feisty Women's Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Gross, Ironman champion, PhD in women's history, and founder and CEO of Feisty Media. I started this show because I wanted to cut through the BS of diet culture and fitness culture and actually learn from high-achieving women at the top of their game who have figured out how to feel and perform their best at every stage of life. So I chat with experts, elite athletes, and leaders who have learned to succeed despite the massive gender data gap in exercise and medical science and product development. Every episode is filled with information, advice, and anecdotes that will help you fulfill your potential as an athlete, mom, leader, or business owner. And listen up. If you don't subscribe to our Women's Performance newsletter, you are definitely missing out. It's totally free. So head over to womensperformance.com and subscribe now. That's womensperformance.com. This podcast is a production of Feisty Media. Hello. Welcome to another episode of the Feisty Women's Performance Podcast. I am hot off an interview with today's guest, and she left me with such good energy, and I'm very excited to share that interview with you. But first, a couple of feisty announcements. First of all, some of you may have noticed for a couple weeks we have a new sponsor called VJ Shoes. So VJ Shoes, actually apropos to my conversation with my guests today about the outdoors, are designed for people who really like to get out there on the rough trails. So trail runners, hikers, orienteers, these shoes are for you. So if you have not heard of VJ Shoes, I strongly recommend you head on over to their website. We will put that link. We'll put that link in the show notes. And check them out. They are really designed for the outdoor lover. So second up, we also have an International Women's Day special happening. Let's see. This comes out, I guess it will be happening tomorrow if you are listening to this on the first day that it's released. So it is hosted by myself and Celine Yeager. Essentially, Feisty Media is hosting a panel discussion that will be live on Facebook and YouTube. And we'll put this link in the show notes. And myself, and as I mentioned, the host of Hit Play Not Pause, Celine Yeager, is my co-host, and we'll be talking to four special guests. One is Khadija Diggs, who is a Muslima and a triathlete. We have pro cyclist Alison Tetrick, elite para-athlete Jessica Tuamalea, and host of Feisty's All Bodies on Bikes podcast, Marley Blonsky. So it's going to be a really cool discussion about equity in sport, which is actually this year's theme for International Women's Day. And in the conversation, we want to clarify, because I think this is confusing for a lot of folks, like what is the difference between equity and equality? And precisely why is equity necessary when we're talking about women's sports? So spoiler alert, the gist of it is that because each and every woman is different, we have specific needs when it comes to creating equal opportunity in sport. So that's what we're trying to get at. So for example, while equality means equal and opposite, i.e. equal prize money would be a good example of equality. Equity means allotting resources to unique groups in different ways in order to reach an equal outcome. So that is what we're going to discuss on our panel tomorrow. You can watch it live on March 7th at 4 p.m. Pacific. And again, the link for that to come watch will be in the show notes. That episode is also going to appear on this feed on March 8th. So it's a special episode going across all of our Feisty podcast feeds on March 8th on International Women's Day. So I hope you'll join us live, but if you can't, just know you can hear it after. So, drum roll please, my guest today is Alison Mariella Désir, and she is multi-talented. She's a founder, an activist, a connector. She's unapologetically straightforward, which we love here at Feisty, and she's a great communicator, which comes across in the interview. And she has a passion for community health. Alison is the author of the recent book Running While Black, and she's also a TV host and producer. She's the founder of Harlem Run, which is a New York City based running movement, and Run for All Women, which has raised over $150,000 for Planned Parenthood and $270,000 for Black Voters Matter. So Allison and I talk at the beginning of the show, really interesting, about how she learned to continue to be her authentic self in different scenarios, right from the ability to say her or ask people to use her full name, which is Alison Mariella Désir. She definitely likes to hold organizations accountable, measure progress, hold the industry accountable as well to create equitable employment, leadership, and ownership positions and improve inclusion, visibility, and access for Black, Indigenous folks, and people of color. Allison's recent book, Running While Black, is a searing expose on the whiteness of running, a supposedly egalitarian sport, and a call to reimagine the industry. And so before we jump over to Allison, I just want to read you a quote from her website about the book. She says, "Runners know that running brings us to ourselves. But for Black people, the simple act of running has never been simple. It is a declaration of the right to move through the world. If running is claiming public space, why then does it feel like a negotiation?" Allison, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Just finished a run. I'm happy to be here.
Wow. Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I didn't have time to shower after CrossFit, so I rolled in like sweaty. But I think you look good, so we're good.
Thank you.
Yeah. Amazing. We were talking just a minute ago before the show. I asked you about your name because I remember when you spoke at our Women's Performance Summit, you asked us to use your full name, Alison Mariella Désir. And I just thought our audience would be curious about that, about the reasons why you were asking that.
Yeah, so my given name is Alison Mariella Désir. My middle name is actually a combination of my two grandmothers' names. So one was Ella and one was Mariana. So my mother came up with Mariella. And for most of my life, I just use Alison Désir because I felt like Désir was hard enough to say, let alone remember you have the accent, and didn't want white people to struggle with saying my middle name. And then in the course of writing my book, it really dawned on me how, there were ways that I was aware of that I was shifting myself for white people, but with my name, I hadn't really considered that. And now I'm really adamant about people using Alison Mariella Désir when they're in events, on any kind of written materials. And it's interesting. I just recognize there's a lot of pushback, and sometimes it's not intentional. It's also a very American thing to consider your middle name as optional, and that's not in my culture. It's not optional. So it's sort of a crusade that I'm on now to have people recognize me the way that I want to be recognized. And on the larger conversation, it's important to recognize that people can change their name as much as they want, right? Like people can change their identity. This idea that we have to be fixed and not move or not change our minds on things is not true. So yes, for everybody listening, Alison Mariella Désir.
I love it. I love that. My daughter, she's named after her grandmother. She's called Rosalie. And she's 12 now. And as she's growing up, I think she's finding that to be a very feminine name because that's not really who she is. So now she's starting to play around a little bit with like different names. So she's currently calling herself Max. And I just roll with it, just like, that's fine. I'll call you whatever you want.
I think that's the most important thing you can do for somebody is acknowledge them the way that they see themselves. Mm-hmm. So long as there's no harm, right? Like your daughter calling herself Max really is immaterial, right? So, and that goes into a larger conversation we could have or not, but the way that we are so fearful of people wanting to be their authentic self is so problematic.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier, like sort of shifting yourself to fit in with kind of white culture. What are the other ways that you sort of saw yourself doing that or that you have tried to shift?
Yeah, oh my God, so many ways. From the way that I wear my hair. My hair was a large struggle for me for so long because I hated my hair and I just wished that my hair moved like white girls' hair. So I did so many things to my hair. Now I love my hair. I can't believe I ever hated it. I have locks, and I think black hair is just the best hair there is. I can't imagine having any other hair. But my weight, I even when I was very thin, I was like 130 pounds, and I felt like I was fat because I was around white girls who were 100 pounds and who were just naturally built thinner. The way that I talked, the music that I listened to, there really was nothing that was untouched from the white gaze and wanting to fit in, wanting to be accepted. And thankfully, the older I get, and particularly after having a child and seeing and knowing that I want my child to be comfortable in his body, I'm just letting go of all of those things. But I still recognize them being there, right? There are still times when I see a skinny person or skinny white person and or a model and think, wow, if only I look like that, right? And then I have to check myself and recognize that, there's nothing wrong with other body types and shapes. It's just that is what we ingest from the time we're born.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I've lived in a couple other cultures, and I know that like there are ways that I have actually shifted my language essentially to fit in, or to even sometimes lived in places where it's second language English and dumbed down my English. Or I lived in the UK for a long time and would use British phrases. And I think like some of that I wouldn't change, because it's like I wouldn't change it because I like don't want everyone to stop a conversation just because of the way that I'm talking. But I think like you're onto something there with like being super mindful about like about how we are shifting our identities in certain, and I don't want to sound like, my experience as a white woman in British culture is not going to be the same as like you as a Black person in American culture. Like, I don't want to sound like that, but like, it's just like, are there ways, do you sometimes think, okay, I'm shifting, but it's okay? Or do you generally tend to think that like, okay, if I can be more authentically myself, it goes better for you?
I think one thing I want to say that I thought of recently is I went to Atlanta, and right now I live in Seattle, and Seattle's very white. And I went to Atlanta and I just was like, oh my God, look at how all these different bodies, right? Like in Seattle, I'm around a lot of white people who are smaller and whose cultural aesthetic and ideal, the European ideal, is like thin, right? And in Black culture, the main aesthetic is to be curvy and have a big butt and to be, a bigger body. And so when I was in Atlanta, I was just taking in like, whoa, look at how different the aesthetics are, right? And I mean, I didn't change anything about myself, but I just noted, wow, I'd probably be a lot more comfortable in my body if I lived in a place that had that centered a different ideal, right? One that was more in line with how my body is. But regarding shifting, I think I only shift when there's a matter of my safety, right? At this point, I try to be my authentic self in all spaces. But if I'm talking to the police, I'm gonna be the most palatable version of myself so that I'm not killed, right? Like, and I think that when I see white men and women, the way that they fight with police and still make it out unscathed, it's such a privilege. Like the minute I see the police behind me, like I have panic attacks, right? So that is really the only moment that I can think of where I intentionally shift, and it's for life-saving reasons.
Right. That's so wow. I'm wondering, are there things as white people that we can do to help create more space?
Hmm. I mean, I think so. White people as individuals, not so much as thinking about systems, right? So when I think about the idea of professionalism and other norms that white people think are universal but are really rooted in white culture. For example, on trails, you're supposed to be quiet. You're supposed to, um, I can't think off the bat right now, but there are these, rules around what you're supposed to do in outdoor spaces or what you're supposed to do in office environments. And a lot of times those are not things that we've all universally said are inappropriate. They're just things that white people have decided. So I think on professional spaces and outdoor spaces, rethinking what those norms are. I'm actually working on a project with Mass Audubon around norms in the outdoors, because when you go to Mass Audubon, it's a big outdoor recreation space, as you go into this space, there's this sign with all of the things you cannot do. So it has like an X through music, an X through dancing, an X through food, an X, right? And you're like, you're going into this beautiful outdoor space with all of the rules of what are allowed, and who has determined that that is the way to be in the outdoors. Why can't you dance and play music and eat, right? Like, as long as you're not harming the land.
Right.
Rethinking, well, and some of them maybe are useful and sometimes, but rethinking who is creating these rules and why are they necessary? Like, again, nobody should be harmed or feel harmed by these things, but ultimately, like, what does it mean to be professional? Like, well, we all decide that, or white people have decided that. So we all have an opportunity to rethink that, and rethink our spaces.
Yeah. I haven't even got to the first question yet, but but I have another follow-up there about like the space, because we're working at Feisty, we're working on essentially like a nutrition course for active women that also includes like understandings of cultural influences, some of the psychological things that affect us around eating, as well as like the physiology of understanding like how food is processed in our bodies, and the women specific information around that too, around our cycles, perimenopause, all of those things. And I'm very, very mindful of the fact that, or I'm trying to be mindful, I should say, we are, of the fact that like diet culture, it's like it feels like a very white thing to me. Like what you mentioned earlier about like the way that women models look, and still feeling like, we all feel like, I feel those pressures to look that way in a different way, I guess. So I'm wondering if there are ways that, or how does diet culture like affect you personally?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, diet culture is a product of white supremacy, right? Because the idea behind white supremacy, it prioritizes this image of people that is unattainable or attainable for very few, right? So you're to be white, you're to be thin, you're to be seen, not heard, right? And so because we live in white supremacy culture, it affects white, Black people, Asian people, right? It affects everybody, but the origins of it are from white supremacy culture. The thing about nutrition is that nutrition is full of white supremacy culture and all these ideas about, there's actually a book called Eating While Black, and it tells the story of how our foods, and I'm saying our, meaning Black people in this country and throughout the world, and our foods have been demonized and have been said to be less healthy than white alternatives, right? So for example, people are obsessed with kale, but people don't think the same way about cauliflower or collard greens, right? Things that are foods from African American culture. And you see the ways that certain foods are are labeled clean or labeled healthy, and that cleanliness and healthiness is really only ascribed to things that are most available to white people. So nutrition itself is steeped in white supremacy. And I think it's important in the course that you're teaching that you recognize that anything that's prescriptive about what foods are good to eat and what foods are less good to eat, if those foods prioritize white Western foods alone, then what you're saying is that there's something wrong with foods from our culture, right? Like you can eat very healthy and eat only Indian food. You can eat very healthy and eat only Haitian food, Colombian food, right? But not in this country. In this country, the message is that you must eat all these really bland, tasteless things in order to be at your best.
Right. Like for endurance athletes, it's always pasta, and so it's to me, what's wrong?
Grilled chicken and rice. I'm like,
yeah.
Are you kidding? Like some of the best athletes in the world are not eating grilled chicken and rice, but that is the way that nutrition is whitewashed. And I love following people like Alafine Tuliamuk, who's always talking about, not always, but who often shares cultural aspects of her training and things she eats and stuff she does, right? To recognize that there's no single way of taking care of your body, no single food that has to be eaten to take care of your body.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's
Yeah.
helpful. And I'll get some of those resources from you after too and throw them in the show notes. But let's
There's sorry, yeah, and then we can finally get into it. But there's also, and I can't find her name right now, but I'll find it for the show notes. There's this nutritionist. She's a Black woman, and she talks all about this. And I'm always so fascinated because it allows me to rethink like things that I've told myself about what's good and bad. And of course, a good and bad binary is always problematic. But I will give you her name later.
okay. Well, speaking of eating while Black,
Yeah.
let's talk about your book, Running While Black.
Yeah.
Since we last heard from you at the Women's Performance Summit, it's been released. What's been the reception of the book so far?
I would say overwhelmingly positive. And that, the only like nasty critiques I get are on social media. And I think that's because that's where trolls hang out. But no, it's sparked a lot of really great conversation and the beginnings of action within the industry. Excuse me, I say the beginnings because my book came out in October and it's far too soon for any meaningful change to take place. But it's really cool to see the ways that people have that stuff in the book has resonated with people, the way that it's also made other people really angry and uncomfortable. Like that's great because that means that something in the book is causing them to rethink something or they're resisting rethinking it, right? Any kind of reaction to something that you read is meaningful. So I've been really thankful for the reception. I did a lot of traveling. I'm still traveling. I get the opportunity to talk to people in person about my book. So I feel really lucky.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to unpack that a little bit. What are the pieces that resonated most with people or where you got the most positive feedback?
Yeah, I mean, Black people everywhere are thanking me for putting this into words, right? Like recognizing that I don't speak for all Black people and that my experience is just one slice of life, right? Like I am a first generation American. My parents came from other countries. I grew up in a middle class household, was in white spaces all my life. Like that is one story of the many types of experiences that Black people can have. But Black people are saying like, thank you for putting this into words. Like you're saying the stuff that we all say to each other, but that we never tell white people because it's not worth our time, right?
Yeah.
Because and that's a really interesting thing also that white people often think that they have deep, meaningful relationships with people of color, but those people of color have never actually had conversations around race. And what I say is that if you are not in conversation with people of color around race and identity, then those people actually are not in deep, meaningful relationships with you, right? Because I'll say, I only invest that way in people when there's a sense of safety and a sense that that person will try to be an ally, right? And if I don't feel like they will, then I'm not going to waste my breath. But anyway, so Black people have felt really seen. White people have it's been an awakening for white people, which on the one hand is very frustrating because white people have the ability to live a life of mostly ignorance and but also really positive that my book could be a starting place for white people and other people of privilege to dig in and understand these issues.
Yeah. One thing I really appreciate about you is that, and you've already done this for me during this interview, is like your ability to create a space where I can like bumble through kind of a question where I can be, it's like, oh, did I ask that right? Or what, but I feel like you are very generous that way of like picking up an intention versus, what might accidentally spew out.
I'm glad you feel that, and I think it's a practice that I work on. It's part of the fact that I went to school for counseling psychology, and also that I'm inherently a community builder, and so I want to bring people together in a way, but also recognizing that I have a ton of privilege being, in a smaller body, being pretty, being educated. And so I'm able to say things that somebody else might not be able to say because their tone of voice might be taken wrong, or the way that they look, or they may be perceived as hostile, right? So I also take that privilege as a responsibility to be in these conversations and also set boundaries when I don't want to be in those conversations. So that's a uniqueness I think I have.
Yeah, it seems like for the little I know you, you do a great job of it. But you've mentioned a couple times like trolls and anger, kind of some elements of the book that induced anger. Like, what are some of those things? I'm also curious about how you deal with that too.
Yeah. So, probably the most controversial thing. I mean, I said a lot of controversial things. The thing that people have felt is most controversial is the chapter around the Boston Marathon. And it's really, it's actually kind of funny to me to see how invested people are in this idea of privilege that they get from the Boston Marathon and how much they want to resist losing that, or they want to resist the feeling that um, the fact that they like the Boston Marathon is problematic, right? They want it to be okay that they love this race that's very exclusive and historically white, right? Like, why can't that be okay? So people have a lot of trouble with that. Then there's also, there's things that I said about my relationships with brands or things that I've noticed in the industry that even though I didn't name names or companies, that those companies have recognized themselves in the critique and are very upset by it, right? Which, again, if I say something and it registers or it resonates and it makes you angry, then it means that there's something in there, right?
Yeah.
So saying in a place of like, well, what does that mean? Right? Like people, when I was younger, people called me selfish all the time and I hated it. And it's because I was selfish. Like, because, and that's it. My mom said, you're so selfish. Like, you never think about anybody else in the family. And then as I got older, I was like, oh my God, she was so right. Like, and that's why it bothered me so much. Like, somebody tells me I'm selfish now, I will think about it, and then I'll be able to like disconnect or detach myself from that attribute because that's not me. I have instances where I'm being selfish, right? But I was a selfish person. So anyway, I think about those particular brands, people, organizations that have really felt upset and written me off. I like to think that they'll come back around at some point and recognize that there's work to do.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I'm relating a little bit with like my journey of change making too, with women in particular. Like I came from triathlon and we would, the things that we would say 5 years ago that would anger people, now someone's like asking us to speak on stage about that thing. So it's like sometimes it's mind blowing. Like, wow, change can happen quickly. So I think you're right about that some of those places where you're maybe inducing a little anger could come around. Are there times when you actually choose to engage with like someone who is angry, and like how would you decide when to stay in that kind of conversation and when to just set a boundary and leave?
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind people being angry. I think, what I mind is when people are disrespectful and are not coming to because they want to have a conversation, but because they want to prove that I'm wrong. And it's very clear when how people show up for a conversation. So yeah, I've had conversations with people who are angry, people who even at the end of the conversation don't agree with me, and that's okay. But it's when people make accusations or call me names or just say, like, the other day this Black man sent me this long DM about all the things that I should be doing because I'm doing all these other things wrong. And by the way, he's never read my book. He just read an excerpt. And in those moments, I just like laugh. And actually, I put it in my story and I was like, thank you so much for like reorienting me. Where would I be without you? I had no plan for myself without this information you shared with me, right? Because it's like, I mean, how ridiculous are you?
Yeah.
So I guess it depends on how the person approaches me and also my mood and my capacity.
Right. Do you have moments where you know for sure that you've changed someone's mind, like that you remember?
Yeah, actually. And that's really powerful. And it's like people's minds can change. Like, I don't know where we got to this point where you can't teach an old dog new tricks or like that's just not the case. Like, why would we? Life makes no sense if there's not the possibility of us changing and growing, right? Like,
Right.
And for myself, I know that when I moved, now I'm going a little off topic, but when I moved to Seattle, to Washington, I came here with a like no guns, like guns are terrible, period. Like even hunting, bad. Like, how does anybody have a gun? And then I started learning about this organization called Hunters of Color. I started learning about how hunting actually is part of conservation and the importance of hunting, fishing, all of it um, to maintaining a healthy ecosystem. And I was like, whoa, okay, like all hunting isn't bad, right? Of course, like gun control is so important. There's no need for AR-15s, right? Like all of that. But I now see the nuance in this conversation, right? Like
Mm,
I now see that there are things that are part of the indigenous culture that are ceremonial. I eat meat, right? So I now can have a nuanced understanding of the argument.
right.
And like that is possible, people, right? So I think we all need to like let our egos go, allow for the complexity of issues, allow for the fact that it's not for something or against it in every case, that there is gray.
Hmm. Yeah, and yeah, it's really interesting because I know like for myself too, I feel like I'm constantly deciding like when am I going to put the effort into meeting someone where they're at if they're if they're gonna yell at me on Instagram, and then when am I just like saying no to that, or whatever else in between. So it sounds like you have a great attitude towards
Yeah,
all
I
of
mean,
that.
and sometimes I just say like "fuck you" to people on Instagram, like right. Sometimes I lose it, like, and it is what it is. I'm not trying to be perfect, and the good news is that there's like we are not in this alone, right? Like you are not the single person fighting for equity in the triathlon space. I'm not the
Sure.
single person, right? So like when I don't want to do it, like it'll be okay.
And I'm wondering about your own journey too. Like as a young person, do you have any memory of like a moment or a series of moments where you first sort of noticed that like Black folks are excluded from outdoor spaces or from
Mm.
running in particular? Like, do you have some like, you know, stories, or is it just kind of gradual that you noticed?
Yeah, I mean, there are things that stick out to me for sure. I remember in high school when I'd be, in track practice that the white people they were always doing like 5K distances and they would just like disappear for what seemed like forever at track practice. And we would do like 20 to 30 minutes and we'd be done, right? I mean, 20 to 30 like intense minutes, then you go to the weight room. And like it was just always so interesting. And I went to a mostly white school, but to see the division along the color line, right, or showing up at the big track meets when I was in a private school, so we were in the parochial league, and then we would show up at these like county or state meets, and then you'd see like the massive, well-supported track teams where they'd have like 100 sprinters and jumpers, and they were all Black, and they'd have 100 5K, people, and they'd all be white. And it would just be like, whoa, does anybody else see this? Like, do we really think that all the Black people just are better and like this and all the white people, right? Like,
Hmm.
that was very clear to me. But growing up, like when I was younger than that, I knew that I like to play outside, but I didn't think of myself as an outdoors person. Like I was climbing trees, I was doing all kinds of outdoorsy stuff, but I was just outside. Outdoors was always something that I reserved for white people, for people doing like epic things in ultra beautiful places.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. Did you have a moment where you like decided to become an advocate? Or do you see yourself as that? Or like did that just happen over time as well?
I mean, I think that's just like there's a piece of it that's just who I was born to be. Like my parents tell me stories from when I was very young, and I see that in my son now too. Like I didn't understand it when they told me, like, what do you mean? Like you knew that was me. And now I see my son and I'm like, oh my God, it is so clear who my son is gonna be, right? Like unless the world messes him up. But he is just like and now I'm going off topic again, but like he gets really into certain things. Like first it was socks, and he had like hundreds of socks and like had to sleep with his socks. And now it's pieces of tape. And last night I was sleeping in his room on the floor And I just like, there's a bookshelf, and I just looked up and I was like, oh my God, there was like 50 little pieces of tape on the bookshelf
Oh.
over his head. Right? And like, he is like, everybody in the class, like, swarms him, right? And I'm like, oh my God, like this kid is somebody that people are gonna want to hear from and follow. And I was the same way. So that's just, and then it was nurtured by my parents always giving us history lessons at home and playing music from their cultures and supporting me in all of the things that I wanted to do, right? So it was I've always been this way, and it's also been nurtured, and I've had a lot of privilege that I had, the opportunity to pursue lots of different parts of myself.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I'm always interested in, I studied history a little bit. I'm always interested in like untold stories.
Mhm.
Are there like, there always are, I guess, but are there like interesting and untold stories about like Black women runners in the US?
I mean, there's so many. I cover some of them in my book, but
Yeah.
Marilyn Bevins is somebody whose name should be known like Catherine Switzer, right? Like
Hmm.
she should be somebody who is always invited to speak, who has um, things named after her, or Wyoming Tyus, she is somebody who should have had endorsements all her life, but being Black, being a woman in this country was then and remains now something that's not prioritized or celebrated. So there's so many stories of people who never got their time to shine. Actually, a friend of mine, Amira Rose Davis, who's a historian and just an incredible person, she has a book coming out called Can't Eat a Medal: Stories of Women During the Jim Crow Era. I forget the subtitle, but it's about women like Wyoming Tyus, who Wyoming Tyus is the first person, male or female, to win back-to-back gold in the 100-meter dash.
Mm.
First of all, people don't attribute that to her. They tend to attribute it to Carl Lewis or a man. And second of all she got was her medal, right? You can't eat a medal. Like, she did not get endorsement deals. She did not have the opportunity to really have a long career in the sport because of living through Jim Crow era, and when women didn't have rights. So she had to pursue something else. But imagine being one of the greatest of all time and having nothing to show for it in a material sense or in a sense of being celebrated.
Yeah. Wow. I bet there's tons of stories.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And tell us a little bit about your own journey into running too. I think I read somewhere that, you had your own mental health issues. That's something that I strongly relate to as well. Like, what does running do for you in your life?
Yeah. So I started running I was a sprinter growing up, and I ran the 400 and the 400-meter hurdles.
Mhm.
But I started running distance in 2012. I was very depressed, but I saw on Instagram, or Instagram didn't even exist, or if it did, I wasn't on it. I saw on Facebook, a
Mhm.
friend of mine was training for a marathon, and he was is a black guy, and was like, 200 pounds, 5'8", like not a skinny person. And I was really struck by that because I had never seen that. I thought that, if you were a marathoner, if you were a regular person, you were white and thin. And if you were, the only Black people I knew who ran marathons were East Africans. So to see him running really struck me. And a year later, I ended up signing up for the same program that he was in, Team in Training, and raising money for a nonprofit. And I found that it really brought me back to myself. It showed me that I was capable of taking on big challenges, that if I broke it up into small parts, I could, you know, celebrate small wins while moving towards this larger goal. And it's the only reason why I'm still here. And once I experienced that, I finished the marathon, raised over $5,000 for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. And I decided that I wanted to share that experience with other people. And I started a running group. And it really, if I could have told myself then that this is where I'd be, like, I would
Mhm.
never even believe it, because it was just this very personal moment for me of my life being saved and transformed, and wanting other people to experience that.
And what gets you out the door now? Like today, you just came back from a run. What's your motivation?
So I gave birth 3.5 years ago, and for the past 3.5 years, I've kept feeling like, oh, now I feel good. But
Mm.
I realize now that I never actually felt good. So now I feel good. And I'm finally like I'm training for a bunch of races this spring, and it just feels so good to be able to move my body. Like my body's very different than it was before I gave birth, and I'm finally starting to like this body, and not just because of what it can do, but because, it's a body, right? Like I'm thankful for it. And not every day. Like some days I really wish that I could go back in time, or wish I had appreciated a different version of myself. But running makes me feel powerful. It makes me feel connected with myself, and I'm just happy to be enjoying it again. I didn't think it was possible.
Yeah, you mentioned there that you've sort of come to enjoy being in your own body. How did that shift happen? Like, is that something mentally for you, and the things that you tell yourself that you changed?
Yeah, totally. I think it's a lot of different things. I mean, it's 3.5 years, I guess, is not a long time, but it's felt like forever in this journey for myself. But I really was my initial models, or this additional images of people being pregnant, running, and then getting back to running, was so distorted by like who I was following and who was in my circle, right? It was either like Olympians who I knew, like friends of mine who were getting back to training. And I was comparing myself to like Alicia Montano and Allison Felix, which is ridiculous because we actually were not at the same starting point. So how could we then, how could I end up where they were after giving birth? So there was that. And then there was also just the fact that in society, we don't talk about like change. Like we don't talk about the fact that like nothing about you stays the same, not your body, not your beliefs, not your right anything. And so I just wasn't prepared for the fact that I had changed and wasn't going to go back to who I was. So I think it's been being patient with myself, surrounding myself with um, more people who have different stories around giving birth and postpartum, diversifying who I watch or who I look at on social media, right? Like people who are not, like people like Lizzo, honestly, like who are not, she's like, I shouldn't be celebrated for the fact that I'm fat and I love myself. Like that is not a cause for celebration. Like fat people like their bodies, right? This idea that all fat people wish they were not fat is just untrue. So, and she also says that her body is like the least interesting part of her, right? So not being around, I wish I could be around Lizzo, but surrounding myself with social media, with literature, with different media in general that talks about being healthy at every size, and expands my views of myself, even being talking to disability activists who remind me that this obsession with the body and what it does is really ableist, right? Because there are people whose bodies don't do anything, and that doesn't make them bad people or make their life inspiring, or right, like a body is just a container. So I've mostly like education has helped me on my journey.
For decades, running shoes have been researched, tested, and designed for men. Brands have relied on the shrink it and pink it approach to sell male shoes to female customers. That's why we are so excited to be working with Hedas. Hedas designs athletic footwear for women that elevates performance, safety, and style. Hedas unlocks the science behind women's biomechanics through dedicated research, creates better shoes for women that support their longevity and performance, and establishes new design standards to promote transparency in a male-biased industry. Hedas have a lower ankle collar to reduce rubbing, a breathable mesh toe box to allow for ventilation and to allow for female toe shape, a special kind of plate in the midsole to keep tired legs going, A narrow heel cup to reduce heel slippage and take the pressure off our Achilles, and a rounded instep to create a snug fit. Hedes has 3 shoe models designed for different sessions: the Alma Cruise for long runs, the Alma Tempo for training days, and the Alma Speed for pushing the pace. I've personally been running in the Alma Cruise and I love them. It's the shoe I always wanted and never knew I needed. The fit is perfect in every way. You can get your own pair of Hedes at hedes.com and use the code Feisty20 for 20% off. That's Feisty20 at hedes.com, and it will all be in the show notes. As we head into summer, rest and recovery are critical for improving sports performance, reducing stress, and living a long and healthy life. We should all invest in better sleep. So, think about the thing you lay your head on for 8 hours a night. If it's not exactly right for you, it can lead to needless tossing and turning, or worse, have you waking up with an unrelenting kink in your neck. My new Lagoon pillow has helped me improve my sleep immensely by pairing me with the performance pillow that has everything I need. So I personally was matched with the Otter pillow. Shout out to Team Otter, which I love because it has a gentle cooling effect. And I was able to choose how much stuffing I wanted in it, which is super important to me because I'm doing a decent amount of CrossFit these days and my shoulders are kind of creaky. So having a pillow that is stuffed just to the right height keeps my neck and head in exactly the right position and comfortable for the entire night. And as of fall 2023, Lagoon launched their 100% mulberry silk pillowcases. It's cool to the touch, buttery soft, and great for your skin and hair. You've got to go check out this pillowcase if you want to feel great and look great every morning. Waking up for morning workouts has never felt better. I'm refreshed and pain-free thanks to my Lagoon pillow. To check it out for yourself, go to lagoonsleep.com/performance and take the 2-minute sleep quiz to find your perfect pillow match. And then use the code PERFORMANCE for 15% off your first purchase. That's code PERFORMANCE at lagoonsleep.com/performance, whole 15% off, and the link is in the show notes. You can just click through there. As a lifelong runner and triathlete turned CrossFitter, I am stoked to announce that the athletic eyewear brand Tifosi Optics has joined us as a partner here at Feisty Media. Tifosi sports glasses hit all the marks for athletes. They're shatterproof polybicarbonate, so the lenses not only reduce glare, but also offer scratch resistance, which I 100% need. They stay in place when you're moving. The hydrophilic rubber nose pads actually get more grippy the more you sweat, so they are secure and don't slide down your face even when you're running in hot conditions. No matter what sport you do, Tifosi has shades for you. Whether you love tennis, fishing, pickleball, running, cycling, or just hanging out on the beach. They are super reasonably priced, which I love, so I can have multiple pairs that go with any outfit. And of course, Feisty listeners get a special discount. So head on over to tifosioptics.com and use the code FM20. FM as in Feisty Media to get 20% off your order. That's FM20 at tifosioptics.com. I'll put a link in the show notes to make it easy for you. Can I ask about your postpartum journey? We had, we had a couple episodes a while back that where we interviewed a researcher and also an athlete who was she's 35 weeks pregnant when I interviewed her, who had continued to train. But this researcher had been part of a study where they looked at 42 elite athletes and looked at their training logs during and after pregnancy. So like a lot of the focus of the interview was around like what these elite athletes had done. But I was like very mindful, like coming out of that like that's not necessarily everyone's story. Like what was your, like, it sounds like it was kind of transformational for you a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and look, I'm so glad that there's more research that there's research period being done on people, pregnant people and people postpartum, because think about how long civilization has existed, and that research is only just beginning, like in the past 3-4 years.
Right.
But that research is so limited because when you do research on elite athletes, typically research is done on white people, right? Like the results are not transferable to a large population, and yet they're used in a way as though they should be, right? So glad there's research. The research is still very problematic. We talk about that a lot we talked about it a lot in my mental health schooling, just about like these norm groups again, right? So much is extrapolated from this research, but if the norm group is really homogenous, then how could that apply to everybody? But for me, I mean, I actually had to stop running like 16 weeks pregnant, because every time I moved at a certain intensity, I started bleeding, and I went to the emergency room like 3 times thinking I had miscarried, but it was that there was this additional thing. My body was growing a lot of things at the same time. They were growing like massive fibroids that were outpacing the size of my son. And then there was also this just like additional thing growing in my body that was bleeding. So my doctors told me that I shouldn't move. And that was really devastating because I thought that running was going to be a big part of my pregnancy. And then also that meant that I was gaining even more weight, right? Which, despite the fact that you have a literal baby, you're somehow supposed to only gain a certain amount of weight, right? Like there's so many things that we're told that
So
we
it's
have
certain places. Yeah,
yeah, and
like the
so I'm
belly's
like,
okay, but your arm needs to be ripped, you know? Like
and
what?
it's like you're only supposed to gain 25 pounds when you're pregnant. Like that is just so outrageous to me. Anyway, so then I gained like twice that. And then postpartum, I was I struggled with postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety. So I didn't want anybody to hold the baby. I thought that I thought that Corey was going to die. I thought that I was going to squish him, that I was going to throw him off the roof. Like all of these things made it very difficult postpartum. And then I was never sleeping. So then when I felt like, oh, I feel good, I can go for a run, I was exhausted. And I just got into this cycle of feeling like I could never do anything right. And and also like not really liking my son because he was the reason, right? Like he was sucking all the life out of me to the point that I couldn't do things that I enjoyed. um and I want to normalize that experience, right? Like that is actually a super normal thing for people after they give birth, but something that we don't talk about. So now I do want another child. I don't know if I want to go through that again, but I at least recognize that that's a possibility, which is I'm in a better position now than I was before.
Right, you can be better equipped if it happens again. How did you get yourself out of that postpartum depression phase?
Well, my husband said to me, like, Alison, there's something very wrong with you.
Mm,
And he was like, I don't want to be around you.
mhm.
So you need to like call somebody or do something. So um, and me and my mom was staying with us, and me and my mom were fighting, and it was just like a lot. So I spoke to a therapist, and this is despite like I was a trained therapist myself, right? So it just speaks to the fog, how powerful mental health issues can be. Like none of us are free from that. And I was on medication already, and they doubled my medication, and that immediately helped because a lot of the postpartum experience is because of the chemicals in your body, right? Like the hormones, things are just at a very different level than they normally are. So increasing my medication helped, and then getting out the door when we could, right? Because then we very quickly ended up in COVID times. But getting outside for walks, just like being outside was really helpful for me, and having experiences where I was outside with the baby and the baby wasn't harmed, because there was all of this stuff in my head telling me that the baby was gonna die all the time. So yeah, it was a slow process, but thankfully my husband said that to me, because I know people who struggle through postpartum depression and anxiety for years, and before they seek help or before there's an intervention.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, and it implies support, right? Like when someone says something to you, typically they're also going to be there to support you.
Exactly.
Wow.
And I can only imagine how scary that was for my husband, because I was like bananas. My husband probably should have feared for his life in that moment. But shout out to him for saying what needed to be said.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Okay, do you have a new program, I want to call it, maybe called Meaning Through Movement? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so Meaning Through Movement is a tour that combines conversations around mental health, sometimes with therapists or mental health experts, other times with like leading voices and movement. And so what I recognized was that there has not really been spaces where we talk about mental health, things like body image and eating disorders, things like trauma, things like race and gender. Like there's not a lot of spaces within running where we talk about things, despite the fact that all those things impact our ability to run and move and feel fulfilled.
And are
So
sometimes the reason that we're there in the first place, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to create a space where we would talk about those things, and we would also move and just normalize the fact that these conversations happen, right? Like you're not strange or you're not the only person. And I know that 10 years ago when I started running, if there had been a space where people were talking about mental health, I maybe could have gotten to where I am today faster, right? Like maybe
Right.
could have realized like, oh, it's actually quite common to have depression and anxiety. And wow, a lot of people are actually here because they have depression and anxiety. So that is my goal for the series. And this year, I'll have an event at the weekend of the Boston Marathon. I'll have an event in August in LA, September in Philly, and hopefully the last event is in New York, but it'll be 4 in-person events this year.
Cool. I love that so much. I mean, I often think this, like when we're, because like as humans, we look for meaning in our work, right? Like what better thing can we do than like kind of pave the path to make things easier in the places that were difficult for us to make things easier for those coming behind. And that sounds like exactly what you're doing.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just, and it's I know that this is also not a framework that everybody has, because some people think like I suffered, therefore you should suffer. You got to
It's
go
true.
through the right. And it's like, come on. No, like if it was that hard for you and you gain some intel, why not lighten the load, right? So recognizing also that that's not how everyone feels, and that's not actually how every industry works, so
Yep, that's what we're grateful for, people like you doing that work. You also have a show on PBS.
yes, that was a complete surprise in my life. I had been on a panel with this woman, Sarah Menzies, and she's a filmmaker, producer, director, awesome person. She found out that I was moving to Seattle, and she reached out and asked if I wanted to host a TV show. And I was like, sure, why not? Like, and it's been really cool. I got to she asked me like what I would want the show to be about, and I said that I wanted it to be about me moving from New York, coming to Seattle, and wanting to connect with other people of color in the outdoors and see how they were creating organizations and claiming space. And it's been a lot of fun. Season 1 was great. We're now filming season 2. And the coolest part of it is that each episode I get to actually participate in whatever activity these people do. So last season I was kayaking and fly fishing and hiking, and this season I'm going to be skiing and surfing. Like it's so cool for me personally and for visibility, and lots of people it's actually being used in classrooms, even teachers showing kids of color that these opportunities are available to them.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Where can we watch it?
So you can watch it on kcts9.org or crosscut.com. It airs live Thursdays in the Pacific Northwest. So if you're in Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, I think that's all the PNW, you can watch it live. But otherwise, yeah, you can watch the full season. You can stream it on crosscut.com or kcts9.org.
Okay, I will get our producer to look those up so that people have the link. I'm in British Columbia, so
Oh,
I'll
cool.
be able
Okay.
to watch it.
Yeah. It's funny. Before I moved here, Canada was just Canada and there was Toronto. And now I'm like, okay, I have a sense.
Yeah. Awesome. I love it. Okay. Where else can we find you? Where can we buy the book? First of all, what's the best place to support you in that?
Yeah, you can buy the book anywhere. People ask me all the time, and I really appreciate that. But fortunately, it's all the same. So you could buy Running While Black anywhere. If you want an autographed or signed copy, you can either show up at an event that I'm at, and you can find those events at AlisonMDésir.com, or at my website, you can also purchase a book from me directly, and I will sign it and ship it. So you can buy it anywhere, but if you want it personalized, you go to my website. And you can find me on Instagram at Alison M as in Mary Désir.
Awesome. Well, Alison, thank you so much for chatting with us today. Really appreciate you and all the work that you do and sharing your wisdom. So thank you.
Yeah, it went by so quickly. Thank you for the chat. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you made it easy for me.
Thank you.
Endurance sports should be accessible to everyone, right? That's why we are so excited to be partnering with Motive. Motive is one of the fastest growing training apps in the world today, with thousands of amateur athletes signing up every month and a nearly perfect 4.9 star rating in the App Store. You are not a template, and your training plan should not be either. Prepare for running races, triathlons, cycling events, duathlons, or swim runs, however your season schedule shapes up, and get training written by some of the best coaches in the world in each discipline who know what it takes to help amateur athletes reach their goal on race day. The app takes the training written by those experts and then creates the most optimal training plan for your schedule, abilities, and goals. Plus, the training is fully customized to your race schedule, how much you can train each week, your current abilities, and the goals you want to achieve in your race. You can use the app for free as long as you want, or get all the upgraded features from the app for just $19.99 a month. But as a Feisty listener, you can sign up at mymotive.com and use the code Feisty for 2 months of full premium access. That's right, you get 2 months of premium for free. So you quite literally have nothing to lose. So head over to mymotive.com, mymotiv.com, and use the code Feisty, Feisty. And on a personal note, I know the founder of Motive, and he is driven to make triathlon and all endurance sports more accessible for the athletes who care about their performance but who aren't quite ready for a full-time personal coach. If that sounds like you, definitely try the app for 2 months for free. You literally have nothing to lose. Building muscle can be tough, and gains can be so slow, even for those of us who do a lot of strength training. As an ex-endurance athlete who is now in perimenopause, I know this all too well. It can be frustrating to put in the time in the gym and not see the results I'm looking for. That's why it's super important to take the right supplements at the right time. One of those supplements is essential amino acids, which are needed to trigger muscle protein synthesis. Muscle protein synthesis happens when you eat high-quality protein, like eggs or whey. And by supplementing with additional essential amino acids, you can make sure you are getting the full benefit of your training sessions. Targeted essential amino acid formulas can be up to 4 times more effective than just eating protein. I've been taking amino acids for almost a year, and in combination with eating quality protein and a couple other supplements, I have managed to turn the tides on age-related muscle loss, which starts at 30 for women, by the way, and I have continued to make strength gains as I head towards 50. AminoCo has been a long-time sponsor of Feisty Media and has supported all of our brands and podcasts over the years. I recommend starting with AminoCo Perform, and you can grab some at aminoco.com/performance. If you enter the code PERFORMANCE, you will save 30% and receive a free gift if it is your first purchase. Give it a try and let me know how it goes. That's aminoco.com/performance and use the code PERFORMANCE to save 30%.